Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of videos that I'm going to do looking at various points in history as they are depicted in video games, because I find it particularly interesting. I'm a big fan of history itself, and I'm a big fan of obviously games that depict that history, so I thought, let's do some videos looking at the two and how they relate to one another. One of the things I always find really interesting about the Samurai Warriors series and Dynasty Warriors as well is that people often kind of chalk them up as being not very realistic, historically realistic, which is of course true in a sense because you take on the role of a character who can plow through thousands of enemy soldiers without dying, which just wouldn't happen in real life, of course. But on the other hand, I would have to say that I do think that these games are historically authentic in that the characters that they depict are true to the personalities and the legends and the myths that kind of arose from the characters over in the years since. They're depicted in a way that's authentic to that personality, and they're also the battlefields and the historical scenarios that are depicted are also not realistic, authentic, in the sense that, again, liberties have been taken to make them work as video games, but there's that essence, that core of truth in there that kind of it encourages you to kind of look into it further and see what the real history was. So the seed of these videos is to obviously show you, or to talk you through, the real history of what actually happened on these battlefields and place it against some footage from the game of that battle in play, so you can get a sense for, how they compare. So the first video I'm going to do is looking at probably the most important battle through the Sengoku period in Japan, and that's Sekigahara, which took place on 21st of October in 1600. It was basically the Waterloo, I guess you could say, of the Sengoku period. And for those who don't know, Sengoku period was a period in which there was a lot of civil war going on as small lords, knights, I guess you could call them if you want the European equivalent. They started to battle against one another for control of increasingly large bits of domain, and at the time the emperor was quite weak, the shogun was quite weak, so all of these lords were the ones really calling all the shots, and it was a dynamic time. It wasn't a good time for the people, but it was an interesting time in that it threw up an awful lot of characters, which is what Koei's really capitalized on with the Samurai Warriors series. So Sekigahara was the one that finished all of that. After that, the winner of that battle, Yasu Tokugawa, basically took control of Japan and closed the borders, and that's the Tokugawa era, which only ended in the 19th century when the Americans showed up and basically forced Japan to open its borders again. Between that time, it was a very closed country, and it was full of mystique, and you couldn't really visit if you were a foreigner, and that was as a result of the winner of this battle. If the other side had won, it would have been a very different Japan, I think, that we see today. Tokugawa's main opponent in this battle was a fellow by the name of Mitsunari Ishida, and we'll get a bit on with him in a bit. I'll explain a bit about who he was. But the first thing I'll do is kind of outline for you the context of the events leading up to this battle. So Japan basically had a leader who, through the Civil War era, managed to almost grab complete power, and his name was Oda Nobunaga. He's also depicted, obviously, in the Samurai Warriors series. He was not a pleasant guy, but he was a bit of a tactical genius, and had a habit of getting the right people behind him, so he had a much better quality army. He was the first one to really import guns into Japan, so he had better equipped soldiers, and he won battle after battle after battle through clever diplomacy, clever tactics on the field, and just sheer ruthlessness, basically. But it got to the point where his ruthlessness was a bit much for some of his retainers, and one of them betrayed him to the point where he felt the need to commit ritual suicide, which is possibly a fable, but most people accept it as being historically true. So he did that, and then there was no more Oda Nobunaga. Following that, his chief retainer, a guy by the name of Hideyoshi Toyotomi, basically arose to become the most powerful man in Japan. And he's an interesting character in his own right. I'll probably talk about him in a video down the track. He started from very humble roots. His father was just a common foot soldier. And through charisma, pure charisma and tactical genius and so on, he was able to rise up and become a very valued part of Oda's army, and after he passed away was able to take control. He managed to put a bit of peace into Japan for a while, long enough to invade Korea twice. Neither time it worked particularly well for him. Even though his foot soldiers were better than the Koreans had the superior navy, so he was forced to retreat both times. He actually died at the end of the second one, and that left a really big power vacuum in Japan because there were two sides kind of vying for influence under Hideyoshi. That was Ieyasu Tokugawa's side and then Mitsunari Ishida's side. Once that power vacuum was there, those two sides, I guess the conflict between them was inevitable. They started to gather troops, they started to play games of political intrigue, and it all came to a head eventually when the forces started to actively march on one another. Now, Ieyasu Tokugawa won this battle because, well, for a number of reasons, obviously, but he actually went into the battle, into Sekigahara, with a smaller force. What won it for him was the fact that he had better relationships with most of the other leaders, and even leaders on the other side. He tended to have that better perception, or he was a more capable leader, he was a more legitimate leader, and Mitsunari Ishida was really unpopular. He was not liked well at all. He did actually have in his control Hideyoshi Toyotomi's son, but it was a young child, and that gave him some legitimacy to at least demand the support of some of the other leaders, some of the other daimyos, the lords. But unfortunately for him, there wasn't much loyalty there. And that becomes very important when we start to talk about the foe of Sekigahara itself. So what happened was there was some tensions with another major power, the Osage, up in the north of Japan, and Tokugawa pulled his forces together to go and deal with them because they were becoming a real problem. At that point, Mitsunari Ishida decided that there was room to make his move, and he marched on Osaka Castle, because if he could own Osaka Castle, he had access to Kyoto, which was where the emperor was, and a lot of the figurehead political power. You needed to have Kyoto to really control that. But Tokugawa realized what was going on, and then started to make moves to compensate. And indeed he did. There was a point where Mitsunari Ishida was trying to take over another castle, got bogged down, and unfortunately for him, ended up on the back foot. As a result of that, he needed to retreat. And his retreat took him to the battlefield of Sekigahara, which, by the way, if you ever are in Japan, it's still there. You can still go and explore it and see, what the various forces must have seen when they were arraying against one another. The march, and this is also important, we'll get to it again in a bit, but the march that Ishida did was through really heavy rain, and as a result of the heavy rain, his troops were tired and sodden, and more critically, the gunpowder, his gunner units were also wet, so wet gunpowder doesn't work. So those were kind of taken out of commission, basically. Tokugawa was marching right behind, managed to avoid the majority of that weather, so he actually walked into battle with guns, the advantage of having more guns and more working guns. The advantage that Mitsunari Ishida had was that he was kind of he was in a defensive position, so he managed to get to Sekigahara and get his troops into position in time, whereas Ieyasu Tokugawa was still on the march. So what happened was there was a really heavy fog, and actually the advanced units of scouts from both sides ran into each other and retreated pretty quickly, because they didn't realize that each other was so close. Excuse me. They didn't realize that each other was so close. So the fog lifted a couple of hours later, and the battle basically started before either side was truly prepared for what was going to happen. The first move in the battle was a fella called Mitsunari. Sorry, I apologize. I said that wrong. A force under the Fukushima. Fukushima were the advanced scouts for Ieyasu Tokugawa, and they did a charging attack. Unfortunately for them, because of the rain, they got bogged down pretty quickly, and their march was slowed down, and the battlefield around them became very muddy and very unpleasant, even by the standards of battlefields. Another person that attacked at that point was Naomasa, who was a cavalry leader. and the cavalry charge was kind of the real start of the battle. I guess that's when the real combat started between the two. Now, unfortunately for Mitsunari Ishida, like I said earlier, he didn't have the support of a lot of his troops. He didn't have a true support. They were marching with him, but they weren't exactly what you could call allies. One critical position on the battlefield was the Shimazu. I think I pronounced that right. I apologize if I haven't. But they came from far south, the most southern island of Japan, and they were really there. Well, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, why they were there. I think they were called up to service from loyalty to Hideyoshi Toyotomi, and that loyalty meant that they had to nominally support Mitsunari Ishida because he had he had Toyotomi's son. Because he wasn't particularly loyal, he refused to actually follow orders from Mitsunari Ishida. He actually basically stood there on the battlefield and refused to do anything until it became time to retreat. So that was a major blow to Ishida, and it occupied, that was a major part of his strategy, was to engage these guys to do some flanking maneuvers, and they didn't do it. So that put him on the tactical back foot. Another one that was really critical to the battlefield, and this is a little bit later on, as the more disciplined and better equipped Tokugawa forces started to really push forwards, there was a guy holding a mountain behind Sekigahara, and his name was Kobayakawa, and he had a very large force, 15,000 people or thereabouts. And unfortunately, Ishida had a lot of faith in him, but there's evidence that Ieyasu Tokugawa was actually communicating with him up until the battle happened, and he basically remained neutral through most of it. Both sides were actually sending this force orders to attack the other at the point through most of the battle. And then at one point, it became critical to engage them because the battle was it was in a precarious position. So Ieyasu Tokugawa actually sent some of his gunmen to the mountain and told them to fire on it. And when they did that, that really kicked Kobayakawa into action, and he attacked the other side, Mitsunari Ishida's side. And that attack didn't actually go down particularly well for him. It didn't work out well for him. He ran straight into a really good leader called, what was his name? His name was, sorry, I've lost my notes here. I apologize. I was doing well. He ran straight into, there we go. The Otani. Now, the Otani were a very powerful group, and they were held in reserve as well, although on the back lines. And they were able to deal with Kobayakawa, but unfortunately for them, they were being attacked on other sides as well, and they just didn't have the numbers. So he was forced to retreat. Mitsunari Ishida was forced to retreat with a very small force. Sorry, I forgot to mention. The other thing was that mountain position that Kobayakawa controlled also prevented some pretty critical forces that were loyal to Ishida to march through. So he became a bottleneck, which actually, again, forced that... the greater numbers that Mitsunari Ishida had, he never got a chance to bring them to bear against Ieyasu Tokugawa. Generally considered a pretty poor military leader, I guess, as a result of all of this. So yes, as I mentioned, Mitsunari Ishida was forced to retreat with a very small force. He was caught fairly quickly after that, and he was executed. And that was that. That was the end of the Battle of Sekigahara. It was a very brutal battle. Very brutal battle, and there were great losses on both sides, but there was a very definite victor. It took Ieyasu Tokugawa a couple more years to really clean up the leftovers. There were a couple of other forces that held out right to the end. Most notable of those is Sanada. Sanada was a powerful but small a group of really powerful fighters, but quite small in number. But they were able to hold out a little bit longer. But basically, by the end of this battle, it was all over, and all the major leaders had all bowed to Ieyasu Tokugawa. As a result of this battle, there was a lot of changing of boundaries and lands, because Tokugawa, of course, rewarded those that were loyal to him, or those that at least turned coat. So, for example, Shimazu was able to keep his lands because he didn't follow Mitsunari Ishida's orders. And then other ones were forced into exile because they didn't turn, and or they were executed, depending on how grievously Ieyasu Tokugawa felt that they had harmed him. And yeah, from that point, that's basically the battle, and that's basically what happened through the Battle of Sekigahara. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was interesting. As you probably would have seen, a lot of what I was saying wasn't matching up with what was going on here. Like I said, Koei Tecmo obviously reworks the battle to kind of make it game-worthy, keep it challenging for both sides, make it interesting, make it fit with the technical constraints that they have. But the basic flow of the battle is the same. In this one, I ended up winning for Ieyasu Tokugawa's side. But like I said, there are obvious bits of inaccuracy in there as a result. One of the most obvious things is obviously here I am playing as Ina. She didn't participate in the battle. Historically, she was the daughter of a particularly powerful retainer under Ieyasu Tokugawa, so she's fighting for the right side. But yeah, she didn't really participate in the battle as such. But again, Koei has to do these things in order to make the game work as a game, and I don't think you can really hold that against them in terms of historical authenticity. But at the same time, you play through this game and you have a basic understanding of how Sekigahara worked and its importance. Like, as you can see right here, the final boss for the battle is Otani. As I mentioned, he was the kind of the linchpin for the Mitsunari Ishida forces. He was probably the most powerful one that they had to deal with, and he was the one that potentially could have turned the battle on either side if fortune had fallen his way a bit better. And so it makes sense that he would be the boss of the battle, of the level. But I beat him, and I won. And that's all I really have to say about this particular battle. I will be doing more of these, like I said. I think they're interesting. I hope they're interesting. They're interesting to me anyway, so I'm doing them for me, if nobody else. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one. I think the next one I might do is look at one of the particular characters who was really interesting through the Samurai Warriors period. Thanks very much for listening and watching, and I'll see you at the next one.